warning. You better take warning. Take warning. You better do good. Let your light shine bright. Let your light shine bright. Respect your fellow man as you should. Take warning. You better take warning. Take warning. You better do good. Let your light shine bright. Let your light shine bright. Respect your fellow man as you should. The evil that men do lives after them. The evil that men do lives after them.
All right. Welcome to Anansi Web Education. The song says it. The evil that men do live after them. Eddie Hooper there. Take warning. Take warning. You better take warning. Good night to President Granger. Eddie Hooper, I'm sure you heard that song so many times. Take warning.
Yes, indeed. It was very popular in the days of Calypso, but I think since the days of the internet and cell phones and so on, the Facebook and so on, people don't pay attention to these what they call traditional or classical. I may even call them classical calypsos, but they were not just medley; they all had a message, and I agree with you. That was a very stern. It could almost be a religious song, depending on the interpretation.
I guess if he had Eddie Hooper entered that song into a Mashramani competition, he would have been disqualified. Disqualified indeed. Good evening to all of you. Welcome again to another edition of Anansi Web Education with me, no stranger, President David Arthur Granger. How was your week? Trying to survive, probably cost of living so high, but how was your week, sir?
Well, I have had to resort, by necessity to eating a lot of the food I produce, particularly green vegetables. So I'm getting by. I've learned to survive. I've learned to stay alive by producing some of my own food, and it's advice that I've given, during my tenure in office, from 2015 to 2020, that we have to aim at food security. And unfortunately, I think within recent years, the importation of foreign goods, even tomatoes, carrots, and other broccoli and other things that people eat to stay alive, cost so much. And it's quite impossible now for honest teachers to stay alive with 6.5. And I think we should pay attention. We should listen to the teachers. And some of the threats which were shouted on the streets was that if you don't give us our money, we'll just have private lessons, or we'll just sell, cool drinks. And it means that they're prepared to degrade, the quality of classroom teaching, unless they're treated respectfully. And as far as I'm concerned, I'm you may call a pensioner, but I could imagine a young female teachers, and don't forget 80% of the teachers or more are women, and probably they have children. They can't survive with that 6.5. It's almost an insult. And as one teacher in Region 2 said, we're not children. Don't pick us like children. Treat us with respect. And I think the mood has soured because of disrespect, and I think the government could do better. It could sit down and speak to them. I was faced with similar situation. I had to sit down and speak to them, to the teachers.
What was it like when you sat with them and tried to negotiate?
It was difficult because we just did not have the money. Now we know for the first time in history we had $1 trillion budget. But we tried to cut corners with other areas. It's a large public service. We had nurses to deal with. We had security forces to deal with. we had teachers, and it was difficult. But I think they understood that we were aware of their situation and that we were doing the best in the circumstances. We also had to do things like improve pensions. Uh, in the 10th Parliament, pensioners were getting $7,500 a month. You know, we were able to take it triple that amount. You know, sweepers and cleaners were getting $28,000. So we had to take a balanced approach and make sure that all sectors were treated respectfully. But we have a situation now in which we sat down with the unions in the sugar industry. We had meetings with Gawu and Nasi uh, to explain our actions. So we were not short on communication. We were short of money. We didn't have the sort of money that people have now. But
So you think, like, when you met with the teachers and so forth, the union, they felt sort of respect that is shown to them during the negotiation process to explain, and you think that's what they were looking for, that someone cares, wants to talk to them and explain situation?
I think this is still what they're looking for. They knew that once the situation improved, you know, they would get a greater degree uh, of the things that they needed. And we were aware of the conditions under which teachers particularly operated. And it is a very demanding profession. It's not easy. And for trained teachers, you know, for example, I remember the stipend that was given to trainees at the Sri Lanka College of Education. One day, a student there, obviously, those were the days now, cell phones were now coming in, took a photograph of the breakfast they were getting there, and there were like 8 channels and a slice of bread. It was ludicrous. And we moved to increase the stipend given to trainee teachers, and I think I can say it was not satisfactory, but it was a mark of respect and a sign that we cared. And whenever money was available, we always took care to improve the salaries of the public servants on whom the burden of administration in this country rested. Teachers, nurses, civil servants, and the security forces. Those 4 categories are important, and if they are demoralized and treated shabbily, it will affect this country for a long time to come. And I don't think the present administration understands that. You know, it's not a question of bullying these civil servants. It's a matter of sitting down and speaking to them, find out what they need. Don't try to divide them by calling special groups. Sit down with the union, and it is clear from what happened over the last 2 weeks that the teachers more or less support the GTU and the public servants support the GPSU. Speak to them, for heaven's sake. Let's have a well-managed country.
We didn't hear about this under your presidency, even though, good evening to our listeners. We are going to move on to today's topic. But before we do, though, the threats of taking away their salaries and deduction of union, all of these things seem to be vindictive acts. We didn't see that under your administration when it came to dealing with the unions, whether it's the GTU, whether it's GAU, NASI. We didn't see that sort of vindictive act.
You're quite right. You know, I think we were more people-centered administration. We understood the problems in these services. In fact, my first meeting as president was to speak to the people in the public service. And it is for this reason that I created the first public service staff college, the Bertram Collins College. And I think it was symbolic and very significant that as soon as the People's Progressive Party got into administration, it shut down the staff college. I mean, it signified that they had no interest in trained public servants. They had no interest in respecting the qualification and the quality of service of public servants. Up to now, I'm quite baffled, why they should shut down the only and first public service training college in this country. And what we're seeing on the streets is simply that. And the attitude to the nurses, rather than sit down and speak to the nurses, they prefer to bring foreigners who cannot speak English properly. I've been treated by Cubans; they're quite good, but I use an interpreter. But why not give the local nurses the respect they deserve, and why not, allow them to stay in the country and serve the population? Many of them don't want to migrate. Many of them have children. Many of them have families. But the disregard shown by the PPPC administration to nurses, teachers, public servants, and the security forces is phenomenal. Unfortunately, it is part. I don't, I'm not a medical person, but it seems to be in the DNA of the PPP not to deal with these four sectors of public servants. They can go all the way up and speak to the sugar workers, but somehow or the other, when it comes to speaking to teachers and nurses and public servants, they seem to be very, very resentful of that prospect.
As we prepare to go right into our topic of the day, though, what would be your simple message to the teachers across the country as they continue with their strike action? What would be your message?
The first message is that, personally, ideologically or intellectually, I entirely support their demands. Education is a pillar of our 10-year development plan, what I call the decade of defense and development. And education is impossible without teachers. Everybody knows the measures we took, with the buses and the boats and the bicycles and the books and the meals to get children into school. And there was an improvement, and I think teachers were part of that process. So my message to the teachers would be to continue to demand respect, continue to demand, a living wage from this administration, and continue to hold high the ideals of your profession. They've been trained, they've gone to Cyril Potter College of Education, they've gone to University of Guyana, and they must hold on until they get better. And they have to wear the government down, and the government has to come to the bargaining table and speak to them. We're one country. Why can you speak to, foreigners? Why can you have meetings all around the world and you can't speak to your own people? So I am fully in support of the teaching profession and the teachers who have decided to strike. That's my message to them. Hold on, things will get better.
Absolutely. President David Arthur Granger, as we move into our topic for tonight, the PPPC, back to them again and reminding people what happened. It says here the PPPC administration failed to prevent violence, to protect lives, and to preserve law and order. During the Troubles, several measures to reform the security sector were proposed, but were never implemented seriously and fully. The result was that violence continued throughout the Troubles under the PPP regime. Our first question, Mr. Granger, is what measures were proposed to reform the police force? Please.
The answer is both simple and complex. To make it more understandable, I would say there are four categories of measures. First is organizational, and in the sense that several organizations were involved in the measures, in implementing these measures. And these meant setting up commissions, setting up institutions in order to implement and propel these organizations, these changes in the police force. And international organizations were involved, particularly the United Kingdom government, the Department for International Development, DFID. And they sent down various experts, they sent down consultants. So from an organizational point of view, I would say that there was a solid body of recommendations. Um, Even locally, there was the Discipline Forces Commission. There were commissions on crime and security, border and national security commissions. So, from an organizational point of view, the recommendations were legion, if not legendary. And had they been implemented, we would have been further along the road to a more orderly society. Secondly, there was legislation, and the legislation was intelligent. The legislation was necessary. Um, Measures dealt with, various aspects of crime. There are four aspects which were recommended, including, things like, you know, uh, language, terrorism, and evidence. And these measures were passed, what my mom used to call theater time, in a very short period of time. These four, but at that time the PPP had the majority in the National Assembly. And the legislative framework, I would say, was adequate at that time. Operationally, recommendations were made for the training and command of the police force. You see, now in the international community, people have to abide by internationally agreed criteria and conventions. Conventions against torture, conventions against inhumane treatment of prisoners, conventions again about investigation of murders. And some of these conventions cannot simply be ignored. Maybe they were ignored, a few decades ago, but now it's public knowledge. And there's also the question of communication, that organizations such as the United States Department of State would publish international narcotics control statutory reports or human rights reports, Amnesty International public reports. So communications are now accessible to anyone, with a computer on the internet. So those were some of the measures that people should know what's going on, and you should respect civil society. And there was also the need for education, that one of the recommendations made by the Discipline Forces Commission, that simply admitting persons into the force who had merely just completed a primary education. I think the regulations call for some primary education. Now, it meant that if you joined the police force with some primary education, you could go all the way up to commissioner. And, I don't think that is acceptable in any other jurisdiction, that people have to be given access to what I call the PQS, a Progressive Qualification Scheme. As you go higher in rank, you become a sergeant, you have different responsibilities, you become a gazetted officer, or you become a more senior officer. But because of the complexity of crime, you have to be given advanced education. You can't just have a knack or a hunch because you have some primary education. Unfortunately, criminality today, with the internet and with transnational crimes, cannot be solved by some primary education. It is not a matter of putting the bar too high. Some things are necessary. If you're going to become a doctor, you need to be trained. If you become an accountant, you need to be trained. If you become a pilot, you need to be trained. If you want to become commissioner or a high-ranking police officer, you just have to be trained. So I would say that those were the main groups of measures. I don't want to detail everything now for your listeners, but there had to be organizational change. there had to be legislation change. There had to be operational change, the way police went about the operation, and the accountability um, of police officers. When somebody was shot, how investigations were conducted, and the education of the officers. So those were the main sections within which I think the measures to reform the police force were made. And I am satisfied that um, during the first decade, there was a substantial body of measures which dealt with the reform, operations, legislation, education, communication, and the organization of the Ghana Police Force. And most of them were ignored. I was a member of the Discipline Forces Commission, and I'd say most of the recommendations were ignored. I was a member of the Border and National Security Commission, and most of the recommendations were ignored. So it seemed that the PPC administration was on a completely different route, in which it felt that it's okay to set up the organizations, sign on the dotted line, sign agreements, and just don't enforce them. You know, they agree to the proposals, but don't implement the proposals. That was the technique.
All right. That was the technique indeed. The Discipline Service Commission, I believe, what is it, that you were part of? We're noticing now, over a decade after, they're now saying that the members of the Guyana Police, in order to become a member of the Guyana Police Force, you have to have a sound secondary school education. It's something that you guys proposed over a
20
decade.
years ago.
Yeah, almost 2 decades ago. Sad situation. Let's go to our second question. Why did the measures to reform the police force fail during the Troubles? Why, sir?
I think in part I've answered your question when you posed the first question. There was no will. There's no political will on the part of the PPP administration. Nobody could punish them. They're a sovereign. They're running a sovereign state, and you sign an agreement, and if you wanted to ignore the agreement, well, then you ignored it. And that was the attitude of the PPP. And they knew nobody could put the government in jail. You can't put Guyana in jail. So I think the lack of political will, it was not only disrespect for the Guyanese population, disrespect for the international community, that they could just, throw all these international agreements out of the window. And I think one of the most painful was that the 4.9 million pounds sterling security sector reform action plan was just thrown out of the window. So by the time I got into government, Britain was talking about Brexit, and Britain had no money to spend on Guyana. You would imagine if that money was given to Guyana, if we had made use of it, we would have been a safer society, and we wouldn't be where we are in terms of law enforcement. So the non-implementation was the single most serious reason for the failure to implement the measures. In addition, and of course there's no political will. In addition to that, I believe that the narco traffickers themselves might have asserted some influence. Of course, there is no proof, but it seemed that narco trafficking continued. And again, I refer to my own administration when I set up the National Anti-Narcotics Agency. And when the PPP came into office, they abolished the National Anti-Narcotics Agency. And not surprisingly, narco trafficking resumed. And we had shipments going to Antwerp and Brussels and Amsterdam and other countries. And we had these planes landing at different parts of the hinterland. So there was no suppression of narco trafficking. People just decided to lie low during the APNU AFC administration. And I would say that the measures failed because presumably, and I have no evidence, they exerted influence to make sure that the measures weren't allowed to work. But certainly there was a lack of political will. There was clearly no intention to implement the recommendations. In the worst case, being the recommendation was simply thrown out of the window and rejected. And I think that the narco traffickers turned out to be an influential factor in influencing government policy for one reason or the other. I don't know who they were, but what I know is that at the end of the day, they seem to literally get away with murder.
Absolutely. We're seeing signs of the same: narco traffickers, money launderers, gold smugglers, domestic terrorists, some even finance um, terrorism in other parts of the world. But that's another story. Let's go to our final question for this evening, Mr. Granger. How was the present day crime situation, or sorry, how has the present day crime situation been affected by the failure to reform the police force?
And this is, um, I don't want to say self evident, but uh, I get the impression that there was a high degree of impunity among officers and other persons who were accused of misconduct during the Troubles. It is a well known fact that when certain notorious drug traffickers were arrested, uh, they were in the presence of serving policemen. These policemen in normal jurisdictions would be charged with being absent from duty, much less consorting with drug traffickers. But there was impunity; nobody touched them, And I think that was one issue, the fact that it was impunity. Secondly, it is clear that people who were accused of offenses, um, maybe 10 or 15 years ago, found themselves in prominent positions again. Um, this creates the impression that what they were doing then was okay. Um, and it has had the impact of demoralizing junior members of the force who know of the behavior of some of these persons. And I think some, the police force is a relatively small organization by international standards. Some people are aware that um, some of their members were involved in illegal practices. We have up to now killing of victims on Dartmouth on Region 2, and I think in Haslington in Region 4. And we have cases, a few years ago at Arimo Back Dam, where the police was going on operation, or even with the more recent escape of a wanted man from the Mazruni prison. They just hunted down and killed. So the culture of impunity has never really been erased. And I think there might be members of the police force who think they can still kill and not be charged with murder. And in fact, as I said a few minutes ago, they're literally getting away with murder. And I don't think they're as much out of control as they were during the Troubles, but the attitude has not disappeared completely. And it seems that there's no political will, or there's no will within the force or in the administration to deal with those members of the force who behave as if this was 20 years ago when they could get away with murder. It's really a tragedy. It's a very bad way to run any police organization. And as a result of that, people will continue to leave the country. People continue to migrate because Guyana is actually a very unsafe place. A very unsafe place. And the police force is the main law enforcement agency. And human safety does not seem to be a priority. You know, whether it's traffic, whether it's in the mines, whether it's crime, whether it's making communities safer, whether it's looking after wives who are abused, children in schools. Really, we've been dealing with this topic of violence for several weeks on Anansi. And we will continue to deal with violence until people understand that we have to take a stand against a police force that is not accepting responsibility for making our children and our wives safer.
Absolutely. Well said, President David Arthur Granger. This concludes our program for this evening, which dealt with the PBPC administration failure to prevent violence, to protect lives, and to preserve law and order during the Troubles, which several measures to reform the security sector were proposed but were never implemented seriously and fully. The result was that the violence continued throughout the Troubles. We are seeing signs of that again under yet another PBPC administration. Nothing is taken seriously by these folks in office. President Granger, I thank you so much for your time as always. We will be back again right here on Anansi Web Education, same place, same time next week. And to all our listeners and viewers in Guyana and outside of Guyana, continue to have a wonderful rest of the night, the evening. Mr. Granger, thank you so much as always, and give my regards to Mrs. Granger.
Thank you and good night.
Good night, sir.
Your evil today will blight your tomorrow. So do good today and avoid your sorrow. Take one